I don't think there's easy answers about Joseph Smith and the practice of polygamy.
The traditional way of seeing prophets in Latter-day Saint thought is as a perfect model of morality.
God didn't call perfect, upstanding people to be prophets.
I'd learn these things and I'd look at the essays online, and I'm seeing them leave out all these things on polygamy and giving a whitewashed version of what went on.
Those issues in church history around polygamy make it difficult to trust Joseph Smith.
This was a complex, explosive practice that was certainly not systematized early on. It was certainly not easy for anyone involved. What were they after? What were they thinking? What did they think they were doing?
We're always being tested by our response to these inconveniences or difficulties.
As for myself, I am very unsettled by the polygamy question. I am grateful and want to point out that it is not a Temple Recommend interview. One can still be a good member of the church and believe that polygamy was a colossal mistake.
I'd learned through church materials and church movies that Joseph Smith and Emma, his legal recognized wife, had this beautiful romance. I remember there's this couple in our ward, in our congregation where I grew up, that were so in love, and they were beautiful. He was beautiful, she was beautiful, and they had beautiful children. And I just thought, that's like Joseph and Emma Smith. It wasn't until I got married and I find out Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and not just a sort of polygamist. He was a mega polygamist, over 30 plus wives. And I just couldn't wrap my head around it, because I'm this newlywed and I'm thinking, how could I ever share my husband? And unfortunately, my husband was a dummy, and he made a joke. I was cooking in the kitchen one time and, struggling with these ideas. And I was like, I'm messing up this dinner. And he just made a joke that a lot of Mormon boys make. And he was like, it's okay. If you can't cook, I'll just find another wife in the next life who can be a better cook. And, we laugh, but inside I'm dying. No.
One of the common things that I hear when I talk to people who have left the church are concerns about the character of Joseph Smith. And we know now from the historical records that there are plenty of reasons to be concerned.
We're told essentially these ideas that as the men head west, there's just way more women than men, for instance. And that one of the reasons for polygamy was to provide for the sisters who didn't have any other person to take care of them. And as I dove into the history of Mormonism, it became pretty clear that there was a lot more to it and a lot more unhealthiness.
What I learned is Joseph had at least 32 wives. Some scholars think it's much more than that.
That time and place, there was a lot of experimentation about utopian societies, which included alterations of the traditional family structure.
Emma Smith, his wife, would take in young girls to help. That was very common in the 19th century. Joseph Smith had a relationship with a teenage housemaid, Fanny Alger.
So in today's documents, the Mormon Church would list Fanny as his first plural wife.
Now, the nature of their relationship we don't know a lot about. We do know that Emma Smith was upset. There is one account from a friend of hers that said Emma Smith walked into the barn and caught them together. One of his friends called it a dirty, nasty affair. Fanny left. She drops off the Mormon record. We knew that Emma knew about that. But what Emma didn't know about is Joseph continued to marry women, and a lot of women.
He deceived her in terms of how he was participating in plural marriage and even when. And that's problematic for Latter-day Saints when they encounter that information, together with canonized LDS scripture, D&C section 132, which promises Emma eternal damnation and destruction if she refuses to accept those practices.
Some believe it was dictated by God. Some believe it was dictated to manipulate Emma. Again, it depends on where you situate.
Those are very difficult for Latter-day Saints when they encounter those, and is one of the primary reasons that Latter-day Saints do leave the church over Joseph Smith's morality or lack thereof.
Joseph Smith was not practicing domestic polygamy like Brigham Young did. He was practicing sealing polygamy. The whole point of most of his marriages was to bring people into a great family structure where everyone is sort of linked to everyone else. This was part of his scheme to turn the whole world's population into a single family.
He was so thrilled with this idea of sealing the entire human family back to God. And I think it's really important that we remember that he also had men sealed to him. And so he was thinking of a universal sealing, and this seemed to be the best way to do it.
For me, I think what is most useful in reflecting on the polygamous past of Mormonism is to think about what sort of intuitions, religious intuitions, theological intuitions might have been at the root. The ways that those intuitions were instantiated and practiced in the real world might have been deeply problematic. At the same time, there might be some sort of underlying truth about the importance of community, the importance of being sealed together and bound together in community that possibly went awry.
My great-great-grandfather was Jedediah M. Grant, and he stood proxy for Joseph Smith. His wife was sealed to Joseph Smith while she was married to Jedediah M. Grant. This was a practice that happened for years, decades after Joseph Smith was dead. And it suggests to me that there was an element of polygamy that had nothing to do with sexuality, that was far more about binding families together over the generations.
A lot of us have ancestors that practiced pearl marriage. We recognize that that was filled with all kinds of sacrifice, and they believed that they were doing God's will. You know, I have ancestors that practiced pearl marriage, and I wouldn't want to denigrate what they were doing or what they took themselves to be doing.
There's a hymn that we sing that says, "Sacrifice brings forth the blessings of heaven." And what does that mean when God asks impossible things, you know, things that break your heart? And I think that that's like the Mormon question, right? We don't have a doctrine that necessarily helps you all the time. Sometimes it breaks you first.
I would see my wrestling with my concerns about Joseph Smith's polygamy as a part of what it means to remain faithful. That part of the work of being faithful is not sweeping my questions about Joseph Smith and polygamy under the rug, but leaving them where they are, unresolved as they are, and wrestling with them.
I think anybody for whom polygamy is not a problem is to some extent maybe a little bit morally oblivious. It should be disturbing that Joseph Smith married women without his wife's permission or knowledge, that he married underage girls. I don't think that any of those problems are or should be deal breakers. I think that it is most troubling to those who have unrealistic expectations about the nature of prophetic infallibility.
Unfortunately, it cost him his marriage, but he suffered as a result. And I think looking at his life and how difficult that was, and what he was able to do in spite of his flaws and his failings, is something I think we should consider a little more closely.
Latter-day Saints love assurance, but Latter-day Saints also believe in a gospel plan grounded in agency. If you voted for agency, you voted for messiness. When you give human beings agency, inevitably it will get messy. That's true in Latter-day Saint history as well as history around the world.
So one possibility is that it was a mistake. Joseph was human. He had to navigate his experience, his impressions. So it's at least possible in my mind that it was a mistake.
Looking back at the manuscript, God asked him 3 times not to release the manuscript, and he did. And I'm not sure that a similar conversation didn't happen over the practice of polygamy.
There was more than one warning given to not begin a practice like pearl marriage. There were lots of safeguards against that. If we paid attention as a people to the Book of Mormon, we could have preempted 200 years of really poor historical choices within the Mormon community. And I think what's especially profound for us in the 21st century to see about those passages in the Book of Mormon is that they aren't just warning against a certain kind of family structure or certain kinds of sexual practices, but kind of all in the same breath. Jacob is denouncing racism. Jacob is denouncing classism. He is denouncing the sexual objectification and commodification of women's bodies. And that's not the kind of thing that we've been told to see within that text, but it's actually really evident if we will take a 21st century lens or a feminist lens to the text. We need to be rereading our foundational text for answers to contemporary problems, instead of just relying on the way that it's been interpreted in the past when these issues weren't seen as pressing.
This really showcases God as not violating agency, and he won't, and he takes it very, very seriously.
Some people think Joseph Smith was guided every moment. I don't think so. I think Joseph Smith has these sort of bursts of inspiration, and then he has to carry it out on his own. And he flounders around, he makes mistakes.
Prophets constantly make human mistakes and endeavors. They are not perfect men or women, for that matter. One illustration of that would be Jacob from the Hebrew Bible. He tricks Esau, his brother, into giving him the birthright. He tricks his father Isaac into giving him that sacred blessing afterwards. He himself is tricked into marrying the wrong sister by his father-in-law.
He called people like Moses, who had killed a guy. He called a guy like Noah, who was a drunk. Abraham, who lied about his wife. These were the kinds of characters that are the pillars of biblical faith. And part of the story is that God can call anybody to accomplish his work. I don't rejoice in Joseph Smith's character failings any more than I do anybody else, but it reminds me that God is pretty great and that he can work through people like Joseph Smith, and he can work through people like me, and he can work through ordinary people.
To villainize him, to vilify him, and reduce him to a scoundrel just doesn't account for the whole of his life.
A lot of people have a lot of problem with Joseph Smith. I love Joseph. What an extraordinary human being. You can't dismiss Joseph Smith in any easy way. He's an enigma. In 20 years, between the age of 17 and 38, he produces 4 new books of Holy Scripture. He founds a new world religion. He starts communities and towns, including the second largest city in the state of Illinois. He builds huge temples. This is a superhuman feat.
The plain and precious truths that he restored, the understanding of the eternal nature of our soul, the reality of a heavenly mother, the belief in a father who weeps over our pain, the insistence that we believe in a God who has the power and capacity to save and exalt the entire human family.
I can attest that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God.
The fact that anything came through anybody like the prophet Joseph at all, to me that's the Mormon origin story, that's available to all of us, that we can call that revelation, that inspiration down, and we can live this wild and precious life.
I've never found, as a historian, the smoking gun that shows, oh, that's it. It's all a simple story. It's not there. What's there is this incredibly complex human story where I think I can discern divine ruptures into the story. These folks are wrestling to make sense of their own religious experiences and how they relate to Scripture. You couldn't make it up. It's a drama that's more compelling than any story I've ever found. In fact, it's rather amazing and compelling.
I don't think goodness means that we have to do everything right. I think all of us as human beings, and I think the church is made up of human beings, there's space to make mistakes. There's space to get it wrong.
Ending plural marriage was an improvement. And that gives me hope that the church can continue to be a more egalitarian and loving place as we stick with it.
It seems to me that, like the parable of the treasure in the field, my conclusion is that it's worth buying the whole field for those treasures, regardless of some of the difficulties along the way.